Hello. Today I wanted to take a look at half lotus. So this is of course going to correlate to the Ashtanga yoga practice, and a common question I get is in regards to working toward half lotus, proper technique in half lotus, and ultimately working toward Padmasana, full lotus. So in the first half of primary series, we're being prepped and guided to work our way into a full Padmasana or full lotus slowly over time. And it will be a process, of course. So many people come to the practice with hips feeling tight, blocked, or whatnot. And you have to really keep in mind that in the Ashtanga yoga practice, it is a hip opener. So I often get the questions, should I do extra stretches to be better at primary? And really, you don't have to do that unless you have the time and the energy. Just, again, keep in mind that primary series is really focused on the hip area. And the collection of time of, building up this resistance in the hips, it takes time just as much as it will take time to release and to open. And depending on what your activities were prior to going into the Ashtanga yoga practice, that will also be dependent on how long it takes to possibly open up the hips. And what I find is that when we open up the hips, we really feel more freedom and expansion through the spinal column, through the torso. So the important thing with being guided into half lotus or ultimately full lotus is we must keep the knees healthy. We want to respect what our knee is telling us. We don't want to do any damage in the process of working into half lotus. And often what I will tell practitioners of Ashtanga yoga is it's usually the hip's fault, not the knee. And so you don't want to abuse the knee if the resistance is coming from the hip. So let's take a look at half lotus, how to work into the different steps there. In primary, in the seated poses, our first attempt in half lotus is in Ardha Baddha Padma Paschimottanasana. In the standing sequence, we do work a half lotus as well. That is Ardha Baddha Padma Padmottanasana. And as we look at the other poses in primary, we work into half lotus when it comes to Marichasana B as well as D. And then, of course, when we go into the second half, we work Garbha Padasana, which is that full lotus position. And there's other places that we do full lotus as well. Let's go ahead and take a look how we can keep our knees healthy and mindful as we work into deepening our half lotus position. So one thing that I always recommend is to close down the knee joint, to put it in a secure place as we go into that external rotation to settle into a half lotus position. So how we do that is we want to take the shin bone here and the thigh bone here, our femur, and we want to bring them as close together as possible first. So you can do that in two ways. You can do that by really hugging the knee in and bringing the shin and thigh bone really close together. In this way, I like to do it this way. Some people like to come into this position, bring the shin bone and the thigh bone really close together. So that would be an entryway to then be guided to go further into half lotus. So if I show you this way by hugging the knee in more into the chest, I do that. I really get the heel close to the sit bone. Both bones are essentially coming together. And then from this position, I will rotate. Externally rotate to bring the foot into the opposite hip crease. And that closing down of the knee joint really puts it in a nice secure position where I don't feel pulling or janking on the knee. And I find that this is such a great way to enter into half lotus position. When I was younger in the practice, I used to kind of do things like this, like take the foot and kind of yank it in like that. Not the best thing on all days. Maybe on a very open and maybe an open day where the body feels super warm, it might be okay. But I got out of the habit of doing that because there were some times where it just wasn't such a healthy thing for the knee. So even if I feel very open that day, I still really close down that knee joint and then go into that half lotus position. And I mentioned before that you can also do it this way. You can bring the shin and thigh bone really close together and then lift the foot and rotate a bit forward with the thigh. Settle the foot into the opposite hip crease, like so. Okay? So this is a really great way to work into half lotus without aggravating the knee area. Now, of course, when you're very new to the practice, your half lotus might not look like this, and that's okay. We can still bring the shin bone and the thigh bone together and then slowly work with that rotation, keeping those two bones as close together as possible, and then seeing where we can settle in. So sometimes I've worked with practitioners who, this is their half lotus in the beginning, maybe even the knee is up higher, okay? And then there might be different variations to this, different stages where the foot might be midway to the thigh or a little bit closer to the hip crease, but maybe not fully there. And what I always recommend and guide students in this half lotus position is when the knee is elevated up, you never want to push the knee like this and just try to force it down. Because again, the reason why the knee is lifted is not because it doesn't really have to do with the knee. It really has to do with the hip. So it is the hip that is going to release the knee down toward the floor. That's what you have to keep in mind. So we don't want to aggravate that knee area. We don't want to try to push it down like this. When you injure the knee, it's very slow to heal. At least that is something that I have learned through experience. And so you just don't want to try to push too hard, too soon, too fast, where it might inhibit your progress by doing damage there. So we want to avoid that at all costs. But things will start to open up if you go into the position with really good technique. So it's okay that you might even be here in the beginning. And what I recommend is if your knee is higher than your hip, I wouldn't recommend trying to force yourself to go forward. I find that a little bit of elevation might be okay, like this. So I'm a little bit off the floor. That will be okay to fold forward. But if your knee is really up high, you don't want to try to force yourself forward. I would just recommend holding the knee, even taking the other hand to the other foot, and just keeping your chest lifted. You'll be able to forward fold in other positions. But we want to keep our knees healthy, like I keep repeating over and over again. You're going to get tired of me saying that. So the process that we work with here is sometimes I've had students start with Ardha Baddha Padma Paschimottanasana like this. And then, of course, over time, they can bring that foot a little bit higher. As the hip releases, the knee may drop slowly. This is maybe through many months, depends on the person. And then the foot drawing closer to the hip crease. And then because the hip releases, the knee dropping, and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, the other thing that many people ask me about is this foot. And I always recommend a nice active foot when you're putting it into the hip crease. This comes into play when you're especially doing Marchasana B or D, because sometimes I get the complaint, oh, my ankle is pulling and it doesn't feel so comfortable when I do the position. So for half lotus, you want to do kind of like a Barbie foot where you point the foot, but then you pull the toes back, something like this. And this actually creates a perfect groove to secure into the hip crease. And it also maintains a good position for the ankle, where the ankle stays nice and straight and secure. So this is the position of the foot you want to have when you place it into the hip crease. Keep that foot nice and active so the ankle is in a good straight, secure position. And then when I go into half lotus, the ankle is less likely to bend and torque in a way that's very uncomfortable. So you have to be mindful of that foot when you place it in the hip crease and kind of keep it engaged and strong when you're placing it in that hip crease. So these are a few good tips to think about. Remember, shin bone and thigh bone close together as you then mindfully rotate it into that external rotation of the hip. And that's going to be the starting to slowly over time work into a full lotus position. But first we want to start with that half lotus, of course doing right side and then doing left side. And then that's going to prepare us to be able to go into full lotus at some point in the future, depending on where you are in the practice. So I hope this was very helpful. And if you have any questions or further concerns, just let me know.